is APAC, Australia's public affairs channel.
Well, welcome back. I'm Peter Brown from Swinburne University, and this is the final session. We've kept the really serious stuff until second last. Robert Phiddian will be talking about cartooning in the Australian in the early days and the influence on the rest of the media. And Lisa Waller, on behalf of herself and Kerry McCallum, will be talking about the Australians' coverage of Indigenous affairs over the period 1988 to 2008. Very interesting period in that policy area. So I'll introduce, we're going to try and stick fairly closely to time because we're coming to the close of the conference. So I'll introduce people fairly briefly and we'll get cracking on what promises to be a couple of terrific papers. Robert, as everyone knows by now, is Associate Professor of English at Flinders University. I know his work through his analyses with Hayden Manning of the political cartooning around each federal election, which are always make for fascinating reading, and that fits into his general area of interest, which is political satire, parody and humour. So, Robert, 20 minutes?
Yeah.
That's what you can do.
I reckon, according to my watch, that's exactly 3:30 when I stopped talking, yeah? OK, you've seen the livery of the university? Yep, good. Otherwise, the yellow distracts horribly from the cartoons. OK, as late as 1976, in what must have been one of the last things he wrote, the poet and controversialist James Macquarie asserted in a foreword to a volume of cartoons by George Molnar, and this is a Molnar, I'll explain why in a moment, a collection of his cartoons called Moral Tales, quote, "Satire is essentially a conservative art. Making fun of aberration from an eccentric point of view isn't very rewarding. Good satire measures the angle of divergence of human thought from the norm, that is, from common sense realism." I won't try to analyse that, but what's really interesting about this is, why does this sound so wide of the mark as an account of modern Australian political cartoons? Why do we now tend to assume that cartoons and cartoonists are anything but conservative? It sounds like a world we have lost if it ever existed at all. Paradoxical as it now seems, although in this company it's not paradoxical, the Australian provides a large part of the answer to these questions. The 1950s were a quiet time for political cartooning in Australia. Smith's Weekly had died of natural causes in 1950, and the Bulletin was long past its best, increasingly confined to a rural rump of readers and reactionary politics. I enjoyed the R's in that. Daily newspapers, including The Age, hard though that is to believe now, often lacked editorial cartoons entirely. Just images of footballers, essentially, in The Age, just to maintain the Melbourne-Sydney thing. And some had apolitical funnies for comic relief. Only George Molnar, really, but also perhaps Harry Eyre Jr. in the Sydney Morning Herald. The Sydney Morning Herald still had a tradition. Commanded a prominent place for visual satire as opposed to harmless and, I find, often gormless humour. Even Molnar's focus, however, was more on the social than the political. And although this is, I presume, a political cartoon, 12, 13, 14, 15, give my compliments to Mr Holt, who was at that stage Treasurer. What the Federal Treasurer had to do with the cost of public transport in Sydney, I'm not quite sure. But this is a day that we have seared in our memory at present, the 15th of July 1964. This is the same day as the first day of the Australian, and it looks a wee bit different from the cartoon, which I think I'll show you now, which was in the piece of paper that Paul Kelly first waved around in front of us. It seems only like yesterday. And this is the first cartoon in the Australian, which I'll talk about in a minute. In the 1960s, Australian political cartoons were transformed by three major events. First was the arrival of Les Tanner at the Bulletin in 1961, after Donald Horne was given the job of reviewing Or Killing It by Frank Packer. Horne chose life for the Bulletin and took Australia for the White Man off the banner, and employed Tanner, a communist, although not a vocal one, to take the visual tradition away from the paths trod in the post-war period by cold warriors like Norman Lindsay and Schofield, whose first name I've forgotten for the moment. Ted Schofield, thank you. The Bulletin was the home publication for the Australian black and white art tradition since the 1890s, as many of you will of course know. Tanner used his tenure as cartoon editor there to work a transformation both in style and content for cartoons. To cut a long story short, the cartoons Tanner drew himself and sponsored in others were more visually and politically radical than the house style of the 1950s, especially in the departure from the caricatures and topoi of the laconic bush tradition, which was the defining feature of Australian illustration to this period. Les Tanner was also integral to the third major event when he left the Bulletin in 1967 to go to the Melbourne Age and usher in the visual and critical aspects of the great era of that paper under Graham Perkin and his successors. I learnt to look at cartoons as an adolescent in the 1970s, reading The Age regularly. So it's the paper. I grew up on the paper of Tanner, Tandberg, Lunig, Horner, Spooner, Petty, Nicholson. The visual satirical dimension was as integral, as much a part of the paper as investigative journalism and opinion, in my opinion. The cartoons were integral to the ethos. I think cartoons somehow are. Since I moved to Adelaide in the early 90s, The Australian has been my daily paper, and it's cartoonists, Mitchell, Nicholson, Leake and Kudelka, the ones I read over breakfast. I guess if we're making these, if we're making all these admissions, also my wife works for the Advertiser, so I am partly funded by Rupert Murdoch. However, the numerate among you will notice that I've leapt from first to third. It's the second part of the story that I'm focusing on today. One of the artists Tanner published a lot at the Bulletin in the early 60s was Bruce Petty, whose nervous line and busy images stressed the extent to which cartoons are political commentary rather than illustration. The Age had not... He tried to get a go at the Age after he'd come back from travelling to the UK, particularly, where he got quite a few cartoons into Punch, and back via New York. And then he had a period as a freelancer in the early 60s. His first regular job as a political cartoonist, one of the reasons he came back to Australia was he wanted to draw more political cartoons. His first job was at the Daily Mirror in Sydney from 1963 to the week before this cartoon, when he went up the road to Canberra for the Australian. When he went to be the first cartoonist at the Australian, he was excited at the opportunity. He said in an interview recorded by Anne Turner, "We all went to Canberra like a big wagon train. We were there to enlighten the world. I was pretty much allowed to choose what to draw, but it would be the story of the day or yesterday's story, and in those years the stories were the most powerful that I have known. Australia joined the rest of the world. Asia was joining, but not on our terms. We each had to invent politics based on fairly random inputs and experience." We've seen what Molnar did for July the 15th, 1964. Now consider what Petty did for that day and consider the differences. So let's just visually get the Molnar back again. Beautifully etched, quite mannered, looks a lot older than this for a bunch of reasons. So this was focusing on Barry Goldwater, who was about to become the Republican nominee for president in 1964. What people didn't at that stage know, the beginning of the neoconservative tide, if such a thing exists. And there he is, mimicking the Statue of Liberty, but with a grumpy face, with brinkmanship is what's written there, and the H-bomb coming out of his torch. So this is an expression of anxiety about nuclear terror. It's very much focused on the international perspective. This is not a domestic cartoon. This is part of the Australians' initial ambition to be very international in its focus. Now Molnar, and here's another cartoon from that day, which is particularly unfair to Pat Oliphant, who was at that stage a young cartoonist at the Advertiser, and this is about the eternally vexed problem of there being a fountain in Victoria Square, which those of me from Adelaide realise is an eternal problem for Adelaide. It's an incredibly domestic cartoon on the same day. Molnar and Oliphant exist in primarily realist graphic traditions. They start with the familiar and they distort only for comic effect, primarily for comic effect. Petty's claim on his readers is more openly intellectual. It's more a question of ideas that he wants us to be drawn into. He wants to defamiliarise the world we think we know, shock us into seeing it differently. To use a theatrical analogy contemporary to the period, Molnar is a bit like Noel Coward with his precise social comedy. Petty is a bit like Brecht with the alienation effect. In reality, Oliphant was really just still learning his trade at this point and should be politely left out of the argument. The analogy of difference holds at least a little water for the papers they cartoon for. The Herald of 1964 was a stable part of a stable media landscape, substantial and a little complacent. The Australian was a raucous newcomer, challenging the men's establishment in politics, ideas, and in the broadest sense in its culture. And I guess I'm trying to give some visual cues for this, for which we've had many other sort of historical and personal stories about recently. Now, to make a fairer comparison, the Wednesday wasn't the day Goldwater was nominated Republican leader, so people weren't obliged to do Goldwater cartoons that day. It was a little later in the week, the Friday, that the news got to Australia, and here are Goldwater cartoons by Molnar in the Herald. You generously admit he's an isolationist, a reactionary, a provincial. Now tell me, sir, what have you got against him? So it's quite a powerful critical cartoon, but it seems to me that visually and in terms of the debates about politics, it's in a much more conservative tradition, so that you've got the Midwest guy there, you've got the city slicker there. It's a very good cartoon, but it's a very different sort of cartoon. And this, again, is another fairly traditional cartoon, rather blacked out, I'm afraid, from the microfilm, which I wasn't still working with microfilm for this period. And this is Oliphant, and this is a lot more like his mature work. There he's got the Republican Party elephant, so he's using a rather standard image from the period, and Barry Goldwater on a tightrope there, and then there's a little commentary in the bottom with the tiny figures that have been such a feature of his works hereafter. And finally, on that day, this is actually Bruce's cartoon, which is a pocket cartoon on the front page of the paper, chasing the story. Goldwater wins US, and there's an Australian flag and slouch hats, and someone with an A on his back, just to belabor the point, leaping for the fallout shelter. Petty started alone at the Oz, but was soon joined by Aubrey Collette, with the result that for a long time the paper had 2 editorial cartoons on 4 of the 6 days it was published. Less financially stretched papers made do with 1 cartoonist and often printed nothing in the cartoon's place on his, it was always his regular day off or when he was on holiday. Visual satire clearly mattered to the paper's sense of itself. Collette was politically a strong cartoonist, a radical on matters of Asian politics. He'd been thrown out of Sri Lanka, where he'd been born, for his cartooning, but he was not so visually challenging as Petty. They reflected the critical and the internationalist, the anti-colonialist ethos of the new broadsheet, at least as strongly as any of the early writers or editors. Now, I can see the terminology is loose, but this is what cartoonists do: give visual and emotional form to the ethos of that many-headed beast, a newspaper. For most readers, I dare assert, the editorial cartoon has more impact than the editorial. In fact, I just dare assert it very forcefully, to be honest. Which do you read? Now that cartoons are being confined to galleries a few clicks down on websites, this particular force is being watered down at least. But it was an important thing in late 20th century Australian papers. As I rather suspected, I'm pushing through on time, so I'll skip through the next couple of days. So that's the second cartoon, and this is the trademark busyness of Bruce Petty that many people complain about, where there's all sorts of disarray of lines. Menzies on the one side in the Commonwealth Conference in London, and Jack McEwen kicking the chooks really, rather than feeding them back home. And this is a cartoon about race, particularly the Commonwealth Conference. Again, Menzies. And this is the best you can do off the microfilm. I think the cartoon is visually different on that page. Obviously, something pretty disastrous happened that day in production terms. It was greyed out compared to the newsprint around it. There's Menzies, and there are the black leaders being treated like coolies. And all of these would support much more detailed analysis. And some people didn't like it. N.V. Wallace of the lovely town of Narracourt in the southeast of South Australia in 1966 wrote in a letter to the editor, also, would it be possible to add a little printed explanation of the meaning of Petty's cartoons? I don't think he was being generous. Vane Lindsay, the sort of doyen of mid-20th century cartooning analysis, really didn't like this. He was much more attached to what he called the pride and craft of comic arts, respecting such pioneers as Phil May, who showed the way, style, dash and simplicity of free and lively comic art, which is followed down the years. So he thought cartoons in 1970 had just lost their great age, and I completely disagree with it. It seems to me the last 3 decades of the 20th century were a great age for Australian cartooning. And one of the main reasons is what was started, particularly by Bruce Petty. So, and I have a little bit more on that, which I shall not labour today. What I'm going to do now in the last 6 minutes is follow through a particular thread of cartooning in the first decade. The early bloom of this renaissance in cartooning. I'll illustrate this with a suite of cartoons on the anti-war movements, one of the many threads that could be taken, but obviously a prominent one that was central to the paper. It also permits us to end up in a topical place. So here are a couple of cartoons which are fairly well known, have been anthologised as well, although I did get it from the paper. This is March 1966, the moratorium movement to stop the war in Vietnam. The rat bag element, all these bearded long hairs, and the montaged in the image of the mother and child from Vietnam, wounded. Visually shocking, quite powerful part of the anti-war movement, and at least in 1964 the Australian Arthur Calwell and 8 Quakers were the people against the war. It was an incredibly popular thing when Holt went there slightly later. And this is a powerful intervention in public debate. You don't have to like what it says, but you certainly have to think about it. This, I think, is possible. This came out on the day before Good Friday in 1967, and here is suffering Asian humanity bearing the cross. It's made of words, and the words are the words of the American Secretary of State. So again, you would get an instant visual impact, but also you get a lot more to think about. The use of collage creates a clash of images and registers. It's shockingly new, even avant-garde aesthetic compared to Molnar's cultured line or the wider tradition cherished by Lindsay. The cartoons subordinate form to idea and satirical message, using images as an argumentative shorthand in defiance of the sort of realist expectations that readers will normally have. So they provoke thought and confront moral and visual decorum, particularly realist decorum. You have to address the polemical purpose. So that's the early-ish days of the anti-war movement, while in a sense public opinion was still being fought for. This next cartoon comes from Anzac Day 1969, when really the public debate had been won. So the context is maybe not as controversial, but it's still a pretty powerful cartoon. Let's have a little bit of context. In The Age, Les Tanner was there by 1969. This is his Anzac Day cartoon, and this was about the American nuclear armaments in Australia. So, thank heaven for American defence. At last, we're a nuclear target. That Australian desire to be on the world stage, world classism. But it's still, so that's a fairly naughty thing to do on Anzac Day, really. It's an anti-militarist cartoon. Here's Colette, and we've got mother and a mother and father. The father with his medals, looking at their son with the anti-war banner out the front. Seems like only yesterday he was playing soldiers with you, and so that raises the question. I don't know which side it takes necessarily. That's a sort of consciously, in a sense, a good consciously even-handed cartoon. Neither of these is much preparation, however, for the radical countercultural blast. The next cartoon that Julie knows is coming, I think. This is it. Yeah. And so that was the Saturday paper, the day after Anzac Day. And there you've got the Anzac Day parade going around, talking also, singing hymns. There's a soldier there. Incidentally, the RAN that's destroyed 35 Vietnamese sampans. And then you've got in the middle that Goya-esque image, really. The scale of this membered corpse in the middle, and the corpse has no particular race, has it? No particular battle. That corpse can come from Long Tan or Gallipoli, can be Viet Cong or Anzac. Is shocking. The parade of chattering, hymn-singing spectators is detouring around an emblem of the horror of war worthy of Goya. They are ignorant and almost brutally complacent. The parade has nothing to do with the reality of war and everything to do with the deceptive schemes of politicians. Well, politicians never die. They only do the organising. And Petty's much underrated as a writer because people focus on the images. Would a newspaper do this cartoon next April, 100th year of Anzac? Or would it go with something more like this, which is from the Walkley magazine, which I get from my wife, which is from David Rowe, who's presently the bad boy of Australian cartooning, and this is a much more sentimental image. It's an illustration rather than a cartoon. It's a slightly unfair unfair comparison. But Petty's cartoon is, for mine, just as serious as this, far wiser, really. To conclude, and I'm going to get there within a minute and a half of my time. I'm not doing too badly. I've shown, at least anecdotally, how Petty's work incarnates the anti-establishment ethos of the young newspaper in its first decade. I haven't had time to show the visual and political consequences for other broadsheets, but by 1970 they all looked more like 1964's Australian than they did like 1964's Herald or Age or Advertiser or Courier Mail. Given time, I'd argue that this applied to the approach to news, investigation and opinion as well as cartooning, but obviously I can only assert that. This left-wing impetus in cartooning ends abruptly at the Australian in 1976, or indeed pretty much from October the 15th, 1975, which is my date for the definitive change. It was reborn in the 1990s under Paul Kelly when he employed Nicholson, is flickering now. It thrived, however, in other papers, most notably The Age, for decades, and probably more strongly more recently in the Herald. Anne Turner once told me that she put, no, I don't need that for this purpose. The consensus, there's been a consensus among cartoonists which in some respects comes from their respect for Bruce Petty. It may be breaking down a bit now, but a lot of people still hold the view that cartoonists and other satirists will be lefties. In the really long term, this is simply wrong about satirists. They are reactionaries in the sense that they are reacting against some settled view of the world, the direction you can't really define. But it doesn't have an inevitable ideological charge. So it's been a very strong influence of a couple of people. The particular conclusion to this paper I want to mark some continuities of attack on the ball between the early Australian and its post-1975 manifestations, even while acknowledging the obvious ideological discontinuities. The attack on Anzac for Petty and his colleagues was an attack on the old insular white Australia of the mid-20th century. The Australian was part of that socially progressive movement that wanted to disrupt the complacency of the lucky country, Donald Horne's intentionally sardonic phrase. It has always been a vanguard newspaper. Paul Kelly certainly emphasised that yesterday, wanting to shift the nation's sense of itself, not merely to reflect it. Now its view of Anzac is part of a patriotic movement that mourns the passing of white Australia and supports the expansive view of US cultural military power. Yet the paper still campaigns for many sorts of economic and social reform. The refit mystification of Anzac that is breaking over us in a tsunami of sentiment as the centenary arrives, you can tell I'm really looking forward to it, is a widespread phenomenon. The Aussies' part in this is very different from its part in the anti-militarism of the Vietnam War, but it is part of a continued ambition not merely to express but to shape and influence the heart of the nation, to use the motto. I've been reading it daily for over 2 decades now, without often agreeing with its editorial line. This may be a uniquely personal perversity, I don't know, but I prefer to believe that it is because of something cussed in the paper and shared by Petty's early cartoons, as well as Judith Sloane's economic sermons or Amos Aikman's surveys of Northern Territory politics, which I've been enjoying a lot recently. The Oz has never, I think, been a paper of record. It has often ranted too much, but when it is on song, it is a paper of provocation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Robert.
Yep, we'll do the questions at the end, I take.
We might take some questions for a few minutes now because the paper is so rich.
Okay.
Andrew.
There seems to be a link between that collage effect that Penny had in the early days and Looney now. Looney does a lot of that kind of mixed media collage stuff. Has Looney ever paid tribute to Penny?
Yeah, often actually, as it happens. There's quite a long connection there, as have 80 to 90% of the current cartoonists. The story from that I didn't put in the paper from Anne Turner was in her collection of interviews of cartoonists, she put a Petty on the front because she knew that no one would whinge about that. Anybody else, they'd be bitching. But that they all admired him for 2 reasons. One, because of the example, but also because of the way he has fostered cartooning talent in a generous way over the years. There are just so many stories. And yeah, those of us who've met him realise it's the way he operates. But certainly Lunik grew up in his shadow to a significant extent.
Sorry, Mark.
Just wondering, the following day, was there any public reaction to this cartoon? Have you had a chance to pick it up, like in letters?
I looked for it really, really hard because I thought there had been one. I thought I had heard there had been one, and it is actually, if you read carefully, in the abstract to my paper. I then went and discovered nothing when I went back and looked properly. So I don't know. There wasn't anything in the paper for the next few weeks anyway. But I know I've heard some sort of a story about that. Initially, I thought.
People realised it was one of the great cartoons, and I think it actually, one of those bulletins from Murdoch mentioned it the day after Anzac Day. I'm really glad you showed.
I'd love to get those bulletins from Murdoch too, actually. I wish I'd known about those earlier.
Graham.
Yeah, it was also this cartoon. You said it couldn't be published today. It's something still published today, which I think is right. When do you think it would be? When you